because of keeping kids out of school for a year, that decreases their life expectancy. And he estimated it decreased their life expectancy by like 5 or 6 months, which seems kind of high to me, but certainly decreased their life expectancy by something. And if it decreased their life expectancy by even a day, that would exceed the person years of life saved in prevented COVID deaths.
Hi everyone. Before we start, I want to take a minute to talk about my next book. You may have heard about the story of GameStop in January or February and thought it was all over. You're sadly mistaken. Unfolding online has been a clash between the corrupt practices of Wall Street and the hive mind of the internet. It's a hot, raging information war pitting retail investors against financial giants, swimming in corruption and fraud. The trailer is at the end of this podcast, but if you want to help crowdfund the book or just find out more, you can sign up to my mailing list to get access to a preview of chapter 1, or go to whenmoon.com to read more about the book. The first 200 people to pre-order the book will get a free pack of To the Moon crayons with their book. I just want to make a quick mention of our sponsors. Namecheap are one of the cheapest places on the internet to get a domain name for your next website. I've used Namecheap for all the sites I've ever purchased and have found it really easy to use. Spreaker are a rapidly growing platform for podcast recording, publishing, and monetization, with pricing plans as low as $7 per month. A cheap way to host your podcast and start earning from your back catalogue of shows. Finally, ExpressVPN is the internet's most trusted VPN. Protect your privacy and watch and view content that is location locked. You could even try watching Netflix from a different country. And right now, they're offering 35% off 12 months of ExpressVPN. Please use the links in the description below if you want to support the show. Anyway, here's the podcast. Hello and welcome to another episode of Chatter. Today I am here with Dr. Hugh McTavish. He's the founder and executive director of COVID Sanity. He's a Ph.D. biochemist and immunologist and a patent attorney as well, and the authored referee of 18 scientific journal articles and the inventor of 21 patents. Wow, you wear a lot of hats.
Yeah, I have too much education. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's always good if you're trying to talk about things that are cross-disciplinary. Sometimes you need someone who has had their hand in many different fields in order to see like larger patterns or ways that different fields could be useful to a different one, that you have to be knowledgeable in both in order to see things. It's definitely not a bad thing.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's I'm a bit of a generalist, I'd say, as a scientist, perhaps more than most scientists, and it's definitely good to have some knowledge of other fields for kind of cross-fertilization, and also just to, not necessarily yourself, but to talk to people in other fields, and that I think that generates a lot of new scientific ideas and ideas in general.
Yeah, definitely. So why don't you give us a little bit of idea of your background beyond my sort of short intro there, so people know more about who you are and where you're coming from.
I think so that shows that I'm a scientist. I think another interesting or relevant aspect of my background is I'm a liberal and a Democrat, which is unusual, I guess, in the States of supposedly, at least among elected politicians, very unusual. The only ones who speak out against the lockdowns. I'm anti-lockdown, but a liberal and a Democrat. That's unusual. The only politicians here who speak out against the lockdowns at all are Republicans. In fact, I'm really not aware of a single elected Democrat in the United States who's spoken out against the lockdowns at all. So I think that's relevant. I also started 2 pharmaceutical companies, which, hey, I'll put a plug out for those. So we're raising investment money for one with a drug that prevents cold sores and oral and genital herpes. It boosts the immune response to that. And we're raising money on a site called wefunder.com The name of the company is SqaureX. So if anybody might be interested in investing in that, I think it's a great business proposition, huge market opportunity, and good business proposition. But I'm here to talk about COVID.
Yes. So you have just released a book. Why did you decide to write it? So the book's called COVID, Lockdown, and Sanity, the COVID deaths it prevented, the depression and suicide it caused, what we should have done, and what it shows we could do now to address real crises. So why did you choose to write the book?
From the very beginning, I thought the lockdown approach was a mistake. And I was very surprised that we did this. I did not anticipate that in the US or anywhere else in the world, really, we would order people to stay at home, which is, for the most extreme thing, close the schools, all of these extreme things in response to a virus that from the beginning, I thought it's bad-ish. It's not that terrible. It's basically a bad strain of the flu. So the whole thing was a surprise to me, and I opposed it from the beginning. And for a moment, I doubted my position. I thought, well, once it was clear the world was going into lockdown, I was thinking basically, what are the odds that I'm right and virtually every health department and seemingly every other expert in the world is wrong? But it turns out I was right. And turns out also I was not the only expert who had that opinion, but there was a censorship really going on that they were not allowed to be heard, and I was not allowed to be heard.
Now, for people listening, the basic sort of premise that before anyone runs away and thinks that we're being callous or wanting to kill people's grandparents, the main point, I guess, that you're trying to make, and correct me if I'm interpreting this wrong, is that the lockdowns themselves, whilst they may have saved and prevented some lives from stopping the spread or of the virus in some way, that the cost in terms of suicides, damage to children's development, people's mental health, other diseases going undiagnosed, untreated, and the sort of complete gearing of everything towards COVID is producing a much higher cost, and that's the reason that you felt it was a really bad idea.
Yes, that's exactly the premise. I'm not saying COVID was not bad. It was bad. It's not as bad as the press has made it out to be, but it's certainly worse than an ordinary flu, and has killed a lot of people. 600,000 in the U.S. Some people believe those numbers are inflated, and I think they may be a little bit, but that's not really my point. I accept those numbers. Which is, let's see, 600,000 would be about 2 in 1,000 people in the United States. But the costs are, the harms just vastly exceed the benefits. When you look into how much this has increased depression, my biggest point, the biggest catastrophe is clinical depression. It's absolutely staggering. But also suicides and drug overdose deaths. And those the suicides and drug overdose deaths those are far younger people than people dying of COVID. So it's far more person years of life lost, far more years of life lost per person. And when you multiply it the number of persons, it's significantly more person years of life lost from the suicides and drug overdose deaths we're causing. Yes, and the children, what we've done to children and closed their schools is just, I have big moral problems with that, and I can't understand how there hasn't been more debate about that. So we can go into all that, but on the children, they're at lower risk of dying from COVID. COVID is much less deadly for children, for anyone under age 18 than influenza is. So closing the schools was done, had the effect of harming children. It has no benefit at all to the children. So we decided to sacrifice the interests of children for the interests of their grandparents and great-grandparents. I just think that's nuts. I don't, and there's hardly been any discussion of that, hardly been any acknowledgement that that's what we did, but that's what we did.
Yeah, I mean, there was some. I feel part of the problem is some people have put it clumsily when they've been talking about this. So there was a person who in the UK called Lord Sumption. He's a ex judge from the UK, and like really highly regarded. And he was basically talking about the effect of the lockdowns on years of life lost, and the fact that, you know, in days gone by, it was kind of understood that, or his opinion was, it was understood that we value children's lives above the lives of parents and grandparents, because, you know, they had the most potential. They were the ones that those are the people whose lives we valued more because of the potential. Like if a child dies, you feel worse than if an adult dies, because you know, you see all all those years of potential living gone. And he was kind of dismissed as being callous, but on the grounds that, you know, we should value every life, and that, you know, if we let the children get COVID, that they might get long COVID, or they might inadvertently spread it to grandparents or other people who were more vulnerable. What would be your response to people who kind of make that assertion?
Well, first, they're wrong factually and scientifically about that there was any benefit to closing schools. It did not prevent any deaths at all, actually. And we knew that.
How do you come to that like figure? So what calculation are you making there?
Well, I actually come to the conclusion that the whole lockdown strategy entirely didn't prevent any COVID deaths at all, because there's no correlation of the strength of lockdown strategy to number of deaths between nations of the world or between states of the United States. It's a total scattershot. Sweden, for instance, is the one major country that did not do the lockdown strategy. They've got fewer deaths per capita, COVID deaths per capita, than the United States, Britain, France, Italy, Spain, and Switzerland. More than Germany, but fewer than all those other countries. And when you go beyond that, the whole strategy didn't, as I said, there's no correlation of the strength of lockdowns with number of COVID deaths. But with children also, we now know that asymptomatic people essentially do not transmit COVID. That's not acknowledged by the public health authorities, but that's what the data says. They may in rare cases, but the transmission rate from asymptomatic infected people with COVID is certainly less than 10%, if not zero, compare of the rate from people who are symptomatic. And children are usually asymptomatic entirely. The studies from early on, there were a few studies of schools that there was a study came out of France, one in Australia, one in Sweden, of just kind of an anecdotes, basically, of a particular town that closed their schools or didn't close their schools in comparison, and showing no apparent effect on COVID deaths. One town in France where before they knew COVID was there, the schools were open, and the children, there were like a dozen children known to be infected in that school. Not a single adult became infected from that. No teachers, no other adults did. In Sweden did not close their schools in the spring of 2020. The neighboring nation of Norway did. There were no deaths of children in either country from COVID. The number of cases in children did not differ between the two countries. The overall infection rate and the infection rate of teachers did not differ between the two countries. And teachers are not a high risk group in places in Sweden or places where schools were opened. They're not infected at any higher rate than any other group in society, which is different from, it was reasonable to believe at the beginning that closing schools might cut down the spread, because children are big spreaders of the common cold and influenza. But COVID just happens to behave differently, and we knew that. We knew it was behaving differently by the summer of 2020. So to me, it's just scandalous that anybody closed schools in the fall of 2020 and beyond. There was no reason to do that.
Now, one of the things we've actually seen throughout this whole pandemic is there's been criticism of public health bodies like the FDA or the CDC or in the UK, Public Health England, that their advice as such, or their rules that they've put out, has lagged quite significantly behind the data that's being shown. And obviously there's room for some sort of lag in that, as things get verified and different theories get debated. But when we're talking about, for example, the spread of COVID with asymptomatic people, or how it spreads through aerosols as opposed to droplets, and therefore the efficacy of masks, there's been a lot of issues upon which the initial sort of rules or statements were made and set, and the policy was there, and then it has not been reviewed as such, or updated based on data that appears to be coming forward. Why do you think we've got that sort of entrenched view? Because it's not an outrageous thing for them to say, hey, we've got more data, we know more about this now, we're going to change the rules to suit that. Like, why do you think there has been unwillingness to do that?
Boy, I don't know. It is kind of a mystery, and to me, they've just ignored the data. It didn't fit their preconceived notions, and to a large extent, frankly, lied about the data. In the U.S., I guess the biggest turnaround was the authorities were saying, don't wear masks. It doesn't accomplish anything. You're just denying the mask from the healthcare workers in the spring of 2020. And then they did a 180-degree turn and said everybody should wear masks all the time. And it's the biggest thing to prevent the spread of COVID. And they had no new data when they changed that position. They just made a political choice to change that position. And then we've gotten data on masks. A clinical trial in Denmark where they had 3,000 people wearing masks and 3,000 people not early in the pandemic. And there was when the rest of the society was not wearing masks at the time. And there was no significant difference in infection rate between the two groups. The people wearing masks were 15% less likely to be infected. That was not statistically significant. And the data, the Cochrane reviews, I cite Cochrane reviews in my book. Cochrane reviews is, I believe, essentially the judges of evidence-based medicine. So they publish reviews in various fields of medicine on what works and what doesn't work and what the evidence is for medical interventions. And every year they publish a review on physical interventions to reduce the spread of respiratory diseases, of colds, flu, and specifically COVID this year it included. And their review concluded that masks make no difference or little difference in the spread of respiratory disease and COVID. So they cite the studies for that, and that is the reality. I've looked at the studies also, and that's my conclusion. It's either no difference or little difference. And this clinical trial in Denmark was the best data we've got, and that says no significant difference. But that didn't affect the recommendations of the World Health Organization or the CDC. The World Health Organization, I think, has been better than the U.S. CDC. I don't know about Health England,
Public Health England, yeah.
But they haven't pushed masks as strongly, but they do recommend masks. I don't think there's a basis for doing that. But the whole evidence, it's just bizarre. It's not based on evidence. It's not science. They say we're following the science, and they're doing anything but follow the science. My state of Minnesota, the governor at one point ordered closing of restaurants and bars after 10 p.m. And he said, we have data that most transmission is happening after 10 p.m. in restaurants and bars. That's absurd. You couldn't possibly have that data because we don't even know you don't know where, in most cases, the only time you have a pretty good idea of one person infected with another is if they're living in the same house and they both get infected. You think probably you were infected by your housemate. Other than that, you have no idea who infects who, much less what time of day they were infected. So that was absurd. And of course, they didn't produce the data. It claimed they had the data, but they didn't produce any data because it didn't exist. So yeah, just the whole process. It's not the scientific process. It's they make these conclusions, but they don't cite any data for their conclusions. And if you question it, you're labeled anti-science, when in fact you're pro-science. That's the process of science, is to look at data and debate issues.
Yeah, I mean, it's and the reason that a lot of people could say, you're just rehashing this thing, just it's happened, it's over, we're basically at the end, yeah. Hopefully, maybe, but why are you dwelling on this? We're past it. Why do you think it's so crucial that we learn from this, essentially, or we deal with the mistakes that we've made?
They say we're going to have another pandemic. So I don't want this to ever happen again. And we should be able to rationally discuss public policy and rationally discuss the evidence for and against certain interventions and quantify them when we can. And that's what I do in my book, COVID Lockdown Insanity. The main point I make there is about the depression. I think that's the worst aspect. So I consider depression to be lost time of life, which I think is reasonable. So in other words, spending a year in depression is roughly equivalent to dying a year earlier. It's just a wasted year of your life. The number of people I estimate that. Well, in the U.S., we had 600,000 people die. I think if we had from COVID, if we'd had another 400,000 people die, the infection fatality rate I calculated is 0.46% in the spring wave. If we'd gotten to 1 million or another 400,000 deaths, that would have been herd immunity. So the most that's possible the lockdowns prevented is 400,000 COVID deaths. And I think a generous estimate would be 200,000 COVID deaths in the United States. In reality, I don't think the lockdowns prevented any COVID deaths at all. But let's say they prevented 200,000 COVID deaths, which would be a huge number, obviously. But it's elderly people for the most part. I calculate an average life expectancy lost for each COVID death of 4 years. And most people dying of COVID actually have less than, it's clear that most people dying actually have less than 1 year of life remaining had they not contracted COVID. So 200,000 people times 4 years is 800,000 person years of life. The depression rate in the United States went from 8% to over 27%. We threw almost 1 in 5 Americans into major depression. Our leaders decided it was worth it to throw 63 million people in the United States into major depression, 1 in 5 U.S. citizens into major clinical depression, in order to try to slow the spread of this disease. So I think it's very relevant to ask, is that worth it? Is those our values? So that works out to 316 people thrown into major depression for every 1 COVID death prevented if we saved 200,000 COVID deaths. And I don't think we did save 200,000 COVID deaths. And time of life lost, the average depression episode lasts for 5 months. It works out to 30 times the person years of life lost to depression versus the person years of life saved in preventing 200,000 COVID deaths. So, would it be worth it to you to spend 30 years of your life in major depression in order to live 1 year longer? Of course not. Nobody has, if you value happiness and quality of life at all, then the lockdowns were a mistake. You have to acknowledge lockdowns were a mistake. And then we could look at suicides and drug overdose deaths. Those are also costing more person years of life than the COVID deaths prevented. Plus, we threw 350 kids out of school for every one COVID death prevented if we saved 200,000 lives. Plus, we threw 127 people out of work. It's you look at the numbers, you look at the data. Nobody could say this was worth it. It was a catastrophe. It's the worst public policy since. You almost have to look at genocides to find a public policy. If you consider genocides to be a public policy, to find a public policy that was worth.
Yeah, that's a really stunning level of problems you're citing there. So when you're saying it's 1 in 5 people you've thrown into depression, that doesn't include the people that were already depressed and things got worse.
That's the increase. We went from 8% of the U.S. population depressed to 27%, a little more than 27, almost a 20% increase. The lockdowns threw almost 20% of the U.S. population into depression. I assume it's similar, maybe worse in Britain because your lockdowns were a little stricter than ours for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends where you were. It's and also on that, like if you're counting depression or a year of depression as a year of life lost, you're not really even considering the fact that the depression, like if you're really depressed, you're probably not looking after yourself that well. You're probably not in the best frame of mind, and that's not healthy in like a long term. You're not looking after yourself the best. So you maybe ended up losing years of your life in the future due to the fact that
you probably are. You're right. I don't know what the statistics are, and I just read a book by a Swedish physician on the lockdowns. It was published early in the lockdowns, and he actually estimates, I hadn't thought of this, but he estimates that because of keeping kids out of school for a year, that decreases their life expectancy. And he estimated it decreased their life expectancy by like 5 or 6 months, which seems kind of high to me, but certainly decreased their life expectancy by something. And if it decreased their life expectancy by even a day, that would exceed the person years of life saved and prevented COVID deaths.
I mean, that's stunning as well to think about. Is that because he's assuming that they didn't either get the education, the development, the learning, the growth?
He didn't really explain it. I assume it's kind of a statistical thing that people with less schooling have shorter lifespans than people with more schooling, which would have to do with lots of things, mostly probably income. More schooling is going to lead to more income, and people with higher income live longer than people with shorter income. In this case, I suppose you could question whether it would decrease their income in the sense that all of their classmates also were kept out of school, so it's a lower playing field, but everybody's still on the same playing field. But I don't know.
Yeah, that's concerning. Like, and so where are you finding these figures? Like, where are you going to for your sources? Because
I'm going to exclusively really refereed journal articles, the best quality I can find, and U.S. and world government statistics. For COVID deaths, I use Worldometer, which is a website that's daily updating COVID deaths. That's another thing that I mentioned in my book, and that galls me is we're told literally every day how many people died of COVID the previous day. We haven't even been told maybe we've been told for 2019 by now, certainly not 2020, how many people died from suicide or drug overdose in the United States.
Yeah.
And we're increasing the suicide and drug overdose deaths. And they could accumulate those every day too if they cared about them, if they wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, and the horrifying thing is that the media have been happily playing this up. I mean, I saw one of the undercover videos of Jess Zucker, I think it was from CNN, talking about how they took the death count away, and then they were worrying that they weren't amping up the fear enough to keep people glued to it, and then they put it back up. Like there was a time where they'd taken it away, and then they decided to put it back because they needed something to hook people on, and that's just another horrifying side of this is the fact the media are happy for a crisis to have clicks.
Oh, the media have been awful, absolutely awful. It's complete scaremongering about this, and that it's the worst thing ever. And it's bad-ish. It's not that terrible. But even my point isn't really that whether it's bad, how terrible it is, or whether it's the worst disaster ever. The more important thing is um, how do you respond to that? Bad things happen in life. How do you respond to that? Do you accept that they happen and move on, or do you fight against it? I mean, what's the serenity prayer? Lord, grant me the courage to what is it? Courage to make a difference. The serenity to accept that which I can change, the serenity to accept that which I cannot change, and the wisdom to know the difference between the two. COVID was something we couldn't change. Nothing. The only thing that's made any difference in COVID deaths is the vaccines. That was the only thing we really needed to be working on, was developing a vaccine and getting it out as quickly as possible. The rest of it, it's like getting dumped by your boyfriend or girlfriend, and then you keep going over to her house every day to stalk her, to try to get her to take you back. It's not doing you any good. Just forget about it and move on. This was just a bad thing that happened, and we needed to be wise enough to understand what we could change and what we couldn't change, and we were not. We thought or pretended that shutting schools and ordering everybody to stay at home for 2 months or more, and closing restaurants and bars, and ordering people not to go to health clubs, and ordering them not to go to church, that was going to make a difference. And it didn't make any difference, except to increase suicides and depression.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess a lot of these measures were able to be put in place because people were scared, understandably. And it feels it's a very human sort of reaction, especially in the 21st century, to believe that we can sort of just like wave our hands and science will solve the problem.
We overstate our powers, and we're not very good at accepting. I read a bunch of self-help books and spiritual books, and it's just a problem with human beings that we don't accept reality, and we fight against it instead of accepting it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it makes you feel safer in a way to think that, say, come this disease or virus or whatever it is, that we are smart enough as human beings to have these little wonderful things that just prevent us from getting sick. That we're so smart that we've created these tiny little things that can be, the evolution and nature that's been trying to kill us incessantly for as long as we've existed.
And which actually, our immune systems work pretty well, and we kind of don't. I think we don't trust that exactly because we don't understand how they work. So we'd rather rely on masks because we can kind of understand that idea. You can't see through it. Virus must not be able to pass through it, so that'll protect us. Instead of just trusting that we've evolved, nature has given us the immune systems to fight off diseases and to keep us healthy. I mean, you think about it, it kind of is a miracle that we're assaulted by all these germs for our lives, and most of us manage to make it to a full life anyway. We learn to walk. We don't exactly understand how we do that, and if we tried to teach our kids how to walk, no, put the right foot in front of the left. You're doing this all wrong. It wouldn't work so well.
Yeah, I mean, humans are, well, just nature generally is incredible. Like the balance that we live in, and how something that seems so tiny and insignificant, this one thing that is one out of millions or billions of different pathogens and viruses that exist all around us. This is the one that disrupted the world completely. It just takes that little tiny thing, and then all of a sudden this can throw the world out of balance, essentially. It's quite scary as well at the same time. And I guess that's probably the reason that people like Bill Gates have been going on about this for a long time, because they're aware of how how in the balance the whole thing is, and that they're kind of terrified of something like this throwing the balance out of, or throwing the balance off kilter, and then we're thrown into chaos like this where people died.
Yeah.
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 So, what do you think the biggest consequence that we're not seeing here is? Because do you think children are the biggest call, or the biggest have suffered the most in this situation? And do you think it's possible for the kids to be, as people have said, be resilient, maybe have dealt with this and perhaps become stronger, or at least some of them become more independent, or like is there some sort of silver lining to be drawn there?
I don't really think I don't see a silver lining for kids in this. Yes, I think they've hurt the most. I think everybody's been hurt by this, including the elderly, who were the group we were trying to benefit. But the children, no, being kept out of school for a year, it hurts their educational development, hurts even more their social development, I think. And we've so scaremongered everybody, and including the children. I mean, I'm sure they're under the impression. I'm sure most people are under the impression that this is quite deadly for children. Certainly deadlier than the flu, and in reality, it's much less deadly than the flu for children. So, and they've been taught not to get within 3 feet or 6 feet, a meter or so of other people, I guess. And not to shake hands and not to hug. That's one of the worst things for me is I'm really not that big a hugger. I am a big handshaker, but that we just have given up handshakes and hugs, and I think it's a catastrophe. I think it's terrible, and we're teaching people to be not just children but adults too, to be afraid of being near other human beings and touching other human beings. And touch is so important to us. And so I especially do worry about the children being messed up from being taught that handshakes and hugs are things you shouldn't do. And then maybe next year, I don't know, next year we're supposed to say, okay, now you can shake hands and hugs. That's just going to confuse them.
What do you think that does to do you think it's something that is going to be permanently there for children or for adults? Do you think it's something we kind of unlearn, that fear of other people?
Yeah, I suppose you can to an extent. I mean, for that to happen, though, I think we need to reach a consensus that this was a mistake. If people are still saying, no, this was the right thing to do and we had to do it, then it follows that you shouldn't shake hands and hug with people to not get the flu if we're not worried about COVID anymore. Yeah, so no, I don't see it. I don't see a silver lining to this, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I hope we can sort of get past these things. But then, yeah, the last thing that I'd mentioned we wanted to discuss was this drug that's being touted by quite a lot of people who I have a lot of respect for intellectually. They seem very well considered, and they're being told that they can't even mention the drug that we're not going to say. I will put it in the description below for everyone to check out, but we're not going to say it so that YouTube can't pull the video. But it begins with I, and essentially it's being put forward as a really fantastic way for treating early symptoms of COVID, and it like helps basically to cut it off at the source. But like there's other studies about its efficacy later in the cycle of the virus, or as for long COVID. But like there's the really impressive stuff is when it's taken early on, when you first test positive or have symptoms. And they've got like 60 trials, 31 randomized control trials, with 14 prophylaxis trials showing an 85% improvement in outcomes. I mean, I will link the stuff that I'm talking about below, but people are being censored and removed from LinkedIn, from YouTube, from Twitter, for mentioning like what could be a fantastic treatment. And it
Yeah.
sort of goes back to what we talked about earlier. What have you made of this whole thing where the accepted narrative is set and then not changed based on new data?
Yeah. It's I'm not an expert on that drug, but I have experienced the censorship, and the yes, it's a big problem. I think it's a huge problem. The censorship, and I think that's the correct word for what's going on here. And it's conducted by largely the big tech companies of Google, Facebook, and Amazon. Um, Also, to a lesser extent, mainstream media, newspapers, and TV and TV media. Um, but yeah, that's ridiculous that that cannot be discussed. It's scientific literature. And I don't know if you heard about this story, but in the United States, there was a hearing, a congressional hearing on this drug. C-SPAN, the organization that televises, tapes and televises congressional hearings and airs them on television here as a public service. They posted the video of this congressional hearing discussing this drug with, between Congress people and physicians, experts on treating COVID. YouTube pulled the video of a U.S. congressional hearing and a C-SPAN video. It's absolutely shocking that they would have the hubris to do that, and they got away with it. I don't know why they want to censor that stuff. We've been censored as an organization. My organization, COVIDsanity.org, we are dedicated to providing accurate factual information about the benefits and harms of COVID, as we've discussed, of the lockdown strategy, I should say, as we've discussed here. And for instance, we tried to ads. Our ads were rejected by Google and Facebook, and advertising for my book. Amazon allows us to sell my book. I cannot advertise it on Amazon. So yeah, I think this is ridiculous. We should have free exchange of information. I don't really think anybody should be censored on anything. Just put it all out there. We can be adults about this and trust ourselves to sort through the fact and the fiction and figure it out for ourselves. I do not want Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg deciding for me what I'm entitled to hear and what's true and what's false.
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, I'm not even saying that the drug works. I don't know. I haven't taken it. I haven't talked to my doctor about it. What concerns me is when there's doctors attempting to discuss treatment of a disease that has stopped the world, and they are being told that that's not allowed because a handful of billionaires in Silicon Valley, for whatever reason, have decided that you're not allowed to suggest or mention this. And it's terrifying, because
it's terrifying. Terrifying. It's not along the same lines. President Trump suggested hydroxychloroquine might work early in this pandemic, and that became totally politicized. And it's just like, because Trump said it might work, everybody on the left said, well, he's an idiot. He's wrong about everything else. He's got to be wrong about this. So it's a lie. Even a blind squirrel finds a nut. It's possible he's right about it. It's a scientific question. Shouldn't have anything to do with politics. And the data on that, actually, I think there was some data that the drug worked. And the media actually then, I'm still not sure about it. It never made sense to me. It should work for everybody, but I thought there was probably a subset of patients that it could work for. But anyway, the data is actually both ways on whether that works or not. But the media trumpeted, for instance, this one paper that came out in, I believe, the Journal of the American Medical Association, that claimed to have a database of 100,000 people in China or something that conclusively proved that this drug was harmful. So this was front page news, absolute proof, hydroxychloroquine doesn't work. A couple of weeks later, it turns out it was entirely fraudulent. There was no such database, no data. The entire paper was a fraud. But that didn't, the news was out there, and it was hardly retracted. And a couple months later, a very small, very poor quality study came out that also concluded that hydroxychloroquine didn't work, and then that was trumpeted by the newspapers and the medical journals as, okay, the debate's over now. We know it doesn't work, even though this study was smaller and frankly of lower quality than some of the studies that said it did work.
Yeah, I mean, like, so trying to get into scientific literature is incredibly difficult, and looking at individual studies is a really bad idea for trying to formulate policy. But the fact that the problem here, again, that I want to reiterate, is that it's, as you said, the hubris of YouTube and Twitter and Facebook and Google and all these companies to decide that they are now the arbiters of fact. That is the scariest thing, because no one elected them.
Yeah.
And they have no allegiances to anyone except themselves and their shareholders. And whatever they decide kind of goes, and that is, yeah, a scary route to be going down.
It's very scary. I think that may be that's the most important thing that we should probably address coming out of this. I think is correcting that. And both liberals and conservatives should, I would think, agree that censorship's a bad thing and that we can make up our own minds on this stuff.
Yeah. I mean, why do you think these agencies and media outlets and stuff don't ever suffer reputational consequences for being repeatedly wrong and presenting fraudulent information as true? Because if some blogger on the internet or some podcaster like myself makes one mistake, then we're labeled as conspiracy theorists, misinformation for life. Like,
yep.
You get the brand, and people, like, I'm not saying I get things right very often. There's other podcasters and independent journalists who get things right a lot of the time, and yet they are not held in the same regard as these institutions that consistently and repeatedly get things wrong. Like, there's no consequences there. Well, why do you think that is?
I don't know. It's a good question. I mean, the press, I haven't followed it too closely, but it was a labeled conspiracy theory at the beginning that this was, and false, that this came out of a Chinese lab and was possibly an engineered virus. And now that's I don't know about the engineered part, but the idea that came out of the Chinese lab is probably true and is the consensus opinion. And may well have been engineered in that Chinese lab.
I mean, it took Jon Stewart to rant very crazily about it on Stephen Colbert before we were allowed to consider it as plausible again.
Oh, yeah.
The people who had been saying it for a whole year had been just labeled as crazy and written off, their reputations tarnished. For being right, and the people who tarnished their reputation,
we've got a problem with. It goes beyond COVID. We've had, this cancel culture of you say something that offends somebody, whether you're right or wrong, or oftentimes it's just, there's no right or wrong. It's just different opinions about something, but you're not allowed to have certain opinions. And if you have them, if you have an objectionable opinion or say something wrong, we're going to hound you and try to get you fired from your job and try to guarantee nobody will air you if you're an entertainer again or employ you again. That's a big problem for the idea of democracy and a search for the truth.
Yeah. So before we finish, Hugh, would you like to give a plug for your book, for your organization, your site, whatever?
Thank you.
People.
So the organization is COVID Sanity, and our website is covid-sanity.org. And our mission is to provide accurate factual information about the benefits and harms of the lockdown strategy to COVID. And again, the bottom line is the harms vastly exceed the benefits. It's not close and it's not debatable. And my book is COVID Lockdown Insanity, and spreads it's kind of the same message. I dive into the science. There's a lot of references documenting the facts. I like playing with numbers, and I play with the numbers in the book, as I did a little bit today, to calculate how many COVID deaths we might have prevented, how long they would have lived, how many people were thrown into depression, how many people are thrown into suicide and drug overdose deaths, and how that compares. Anyway, I think people would enjoy reading it. It's a lively, readable book, despite being also scientific, or maybe because being scientific and well documented.
Well, yeah, I will put the links for everything that we've discussed, your book, your website, for SqaureX, and all your stuff in the description below for people who want to check it out. So, yeah, Dr. McTavish, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, Josh. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for making it all the way to the end of the podcast. Don't forget our sponsor, ExpressVPN, and my book, Brexit, the Establishment Civil War, can both be found in the links in the description below. And also, please like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. It's the best way to help us grow. Until next time, thanks for listening.
The animal dragged a child around its enclosure. The child had fallen into that enclosure. Officials are now defending their actions. ABC's Alex.
A few things I am not. I am not a cat. I am not an institutional investor, nor am I a hedge fund.
There's no panic selling. These people, they may have bought at $4, sat through $400, went back to 40, went to 350, back down to 110, and they have not sold. All they've done is bought more. And there's no answer for that. There's no, it is like art of war mastery by a bunch of idiots who should know better. And they're just like, I'm not fucking leaving.
Fly me to the moon, let me play among the stars. Let me see what spring is like on Jupiter and Mars.
What's been happening on Reddit and in social media and in the marketplace has never been seen before.
To short 70, 60, 80% of a company, let alone 140%, I think a lot of people universally believe something is wrong there.
They're powerful. They want a stock higher. It's child's play. Why ever sell into the maw of Wall Street, Reddit bets? Why?
But everyone's wrong. It's like The Big Short again, or more like The Big Short Squeeze this time, right?
So here we got the fox guarding the hen house, and one of the hens is complaining the fox is out to kill us, and the farmer says, I'm sorry, the fox is in charge of the hen house.
Whenever there is not billions, but like trillions of dollars involved in something, I argue that nothing is off the table.
The way they have absolutely cheated, stolen, robbed everyday people so all our hedge fund billionaire friends can get out and not get killed is one of the most remarkable, illegal, shocking robberies in the history, in plain sight.
Super Stonk and the other communities that have emerged are a hive mind, the likes of which we have never seen before. It's madness and brilliance, insanity and genius all rolled into one. It's very possible that Citadel will be gone in a few months. And not just Citadel, but the entire financial system has the potential to come crashing down. These crooks continue to gamble recklessly with the world economy, and this could be the moment that they finally get their justice.
You've got maybe 10 million people doing this who now own, probably more than 100 million shares. And eventually, they might own everything.